Alright, so the Oscars are coming up, the nominations are absolutely stacked. Dune Part 2 is making history. You know, after limping through a pandemic, a streaming overhaul, and numerous strikes, cinema is back and it is back with a force. And I hope everyone can pardon this deviation from my usual writing here. I promise this is not turning into a listicle channel or anything, but after seeing so many phenomenal films this year, and because the 10 Best Picture nominees for the Oscars this year are so incredible, I just had to talk about them. As the conventional wisdom goes, TV is the writer's medium, while film is the director's. And although this channel usually focuses on story writing in particular, I've tried to do right by these 10 films here, and I would be remiss if I didn't say that ranking them therefore felt kinda silly. You know, each directorial vision here is remarkably unique. We have such a wide range, not just of topics, but of moods and affects. And the great thing about these nominees is that, barring I think one or two, you could really make a case for any of them being the best. It all depends on what criteria you think about, and of course, your own subjective experience. So here, I'm obviously not guessing what the actual Oscars result will be, that's boring, nor is this just a straight up list of my favorites based on personal preference. In this ranking, because all of these films are remarkable in the sort of usual terms, I particularly focused on considering three major ideas, and I didn't score them or anything, but they are: 1, the strength and identity of the film as a story; 2, the artistic identity in the medium of film, you know, why is this a film in particular; and 3, the film's capacity to transcend itself and really get in the very bones of its audience. Obviously, that's a super subjective call, but I do think certain films have that capacity more than others, and it is to me the most powerful thing art can do. I repeat myself on this at the end of the video, but I am super curious to hear other people's rankings, or top 3 or top 5 or personal favorite, so please do comment and let me know what you've been watching. Also, shout out to All of Us Strangers, which completely ruined my life and deserved far more critical attention. I've avoided concrete spoilers as much as possible, I've minimized the use of actual clips here, but while I'm not naming literal endings or anything, I am considering these films in their entirety, so consider this your warning in case you're hoping for a blank slate on any of them. In the conclusion, I'll quickly name a few recurring themes I saw amongst these 10 films, which is kind of fun, and please do remember to like and subscribe. I will be back with more regular content soon. But here we go, starting at the bottom. Unsurprisingly, at number 10 here, we have Bradley Cooper's huge award swing, the Leonard Bernstein biopic starring Cooper himself as Bernstein, opposite Carey Mulligan as his wife, the actress Felicia Montealegre. It's not quite a cradle to grave, it's more career launch to career close, which is a great focus here, and I was very excited to learn about someone I didn't know a ton about, alongside art forms, composing and conducting, that I know next to nothing about. And man, this was a visually stunning film. We have a mix of aspect ratios, black and white versus color, and an old school theatricality to scene transitions that absolutely had me hooked. No one scene felt flat to me. I think there are times when Cooper and Mulligan are speaking with an explicit eloquence that feels sorta extra human, but in this heavily stylistic rendering of a life, that works just fine. It's cinematically stunning, and if you're a Bernstein fan, I have to imagine that it's a treat to watch. But it is never a good feeling to walk away from a film that tells a story and wonder why they bothered telling the story at all. The problem with Maestro is without a doubt the screenplay. The film heavily centers the romantic relationship between Leonard and Felicia. It opens with Leonard discussing how much he misses her, and the most dramatic beats of the film center the two in confrontation of some sort. And in the almost realized thematic clash between pursuing greatness and caring for goodness, Felicia's view of Leonard is our moral lens. I don't think it's a spoiler to say that after the already famous scene of Leonard conducting the London Symphony Orchestra, Felicia tells him there's no hate in his heart after all, and this is sort of crucial. This is the ultimate referendum on a complicated artistic genius. And I have no idea why she says it at all, why she says it in that moment in particular, and that's why it doesn't feel like a spoiler to me at all. I mean, the obvious answer is that no one hateful could produce such beauty, and that's one ostensible takeaway here, even as we see him later in life, sweaty and wrinkled and dancing with an impressionable young man. The camera treats its subject, Leonard, as the pinnacle of art and beauty, and that's a concept I can accept intellectually, but I don't feel it as an experience. I don't fall in love with Leonard the way Cooper obviously has. I don't even feel like I know him much better after spending a few hours crawling through his life, which is really disappointing. There's another really interesting concept woven through both subtext and explicit dialogue here, and that's the distinction between public performance and private life, represented through the distinction between conducting and composing, and man, did I want more of that. To me, Leonard felt like largely the same man on and off stage, and the concept that he should hide both his Jewish identity and his homosexuality for the sake of his career is a really tragic story element here that sort of comes and goes without dramatic breathing room. I can't say how much I wanted to love this film. Cooper is getting so much flack for how seriously he's taken it, but I welcome that. Even in this melodramatic presence, Carey Mulligan steals every scene she's in a fantastic performance of the year. This is undeniably a stylistic masterpiece, but without causal, structural, focused story writing, it falls far short of being an artistic one.
I'm just so tired of watching myself and every single other woman tie herself into knots so that people will like us.
We all know this one, not least in part because it's arguably more of a marketing feat than an artistic one, but I'd be lying if I said I didn't enjoy the crap out of Greta Gerwig's plastic Fantasia hero's journey starring Margot Robbie opposite Ryan Gosling and America Ferrera. So much of the discourse on Barbie is on its social impact, but that's a whole separate conversation, really. So anyway, we start off in Barbie Land, and to me, the production design of the film is its strongest attribute. Gerwig and her production team had to capture girlhood imagination, something intrinsically internal, through an external believable world. And as someone who did indeed play with Barbies as a kid, it was wild to see so many corners of my imagination reflected on the screen here. Through the simple trick of flipping patriarchal norms, Gerwig also packs in satirical joke after joke that has us all laughing at relatively sad truths of our own world in a bright pink, sparkly space. And this angle continues as Barbie and Ken enter the real world and are horrified and delighted, respectively. And even though I knew this was one giant corporate commercial of an endeavor, I allowed myself to get pretty excited during the opening act. We have two huge thematic issues open through the story in parallel. One, Barbie herself discovers not only that reality is a scary, patriarchal place, but also that she herself is perceived negatively by some girls. And two, there's a deeply held emotional tension between not just Gloria and her daughter Sasha as characters, but also in their respective understandings of what Barbie is. The daughter Sasha feels stifled by this ideal of a woman. The mother Gloria feels inspired and nostalgic. So how will they reconcile? And how will Barbie come to terms with her own impact on the world? I mean, it was never gonna be super serious or deep or subversive, but there's a great cheesy story buried in there. But the film sidesteps its own questions. Instead, an absurd amount of screen time is devoted to Ken's journey. And I like the idea that in this world, the love interest sidekick gets more attention than, say, I don't know, Kitty Oppenheimer. But it shouldn't be at the expense of Barbie's own structural journey. And I think the commentary on the patriarchy worked far better as satirical subtext than as an explicit narrative focus. Even more frustratingly, Sasha changes her mind about Barbie for no ostensible reason. And this should really be the heart of the film, right? The pure idealism of Barbie, or Barbie as a complicated character winning over this cynical child, or even better, her own mother connecting with her directly. So the problem for me with the famous monologue scene isn't anything to do with whether it's sufficiently contemporary for our world. I don't care about that. It's that it stands out weirdly as the film announcing its core idea instead of demonstrating it through the arc of Barbie's own story. If the controlling idea of the heart of the story underneath the movie Barbie is that there's no way to be a perfect woman, but that there's beauty in the imperfection, I'd love to see that dramatized through story structure, rather than explained through monologue. Barbie even meets her maker at one point, and to me, the scene really falls flat because it just glosses over all the really compelling questions that the opening act of this film asked. So ultimately, I think the problem with Barbie as a film is that it tried to have its cake and eat it too, and for some people, it really worked. But in peeling back the curtain of this undeniably stellar aesthetic production, I remain disheartened by this film and how it seemed to almost avoid completing the very story it started.
Books change people's lives.
Has something I've written never changed your life?
Absolutely. My dining room table was wobbly as hell.
Oh my God.
Before your last book.
At number 8, American Fiction. Man, this film gets a lot done. From Cord Jefferson of TV writing fame, American Fiction stars Jeffrey Wright as Monk Ellison, a professor and author of intellectual literary fiction who's sickened by how stereotypical black stories are marketed and commercially consumed. So sickened that he writes an obscenely over-the-top hood violence novel of his own, drunkenly sends it to his editor who sells it instantly, and suddenly Monk is wound up in a fake convict identity thrown into the world of white publishers who pretend to be or think they are well-meaning. I mean, the satirical premise on its own is hilarious and clever, and the marketing for this film leans way into it, but there's actually another story going on, Monk's personal one, as he moves back home to Massachusetts and becomes reacquainted with his siblings and ailing mother, and starts dating a neighbor and fellow book lover. This side of the story is full of heart, and the moments where the two threads of plot are interwoven are my favorite, as I came to realize that the story here really isn't about the satire, and that the film isn't really going to answer that huge social question of how black stories should be told. It's going to give us an intimate, complicated, stirring story itself, and that's the answer. Jeffrey Wright is magnificent as always. It's high time he plays the lead, and the supporting cast, including Issa Rae and Sterling K. Brown, is absolutely fantastic. American Fiction obviously has a reason to exist as a story, but the reason that it's not higher on the list for me is that I'm not sure it had a particular purpose as a film beyond film being a means to convey story. And to be clear, that's not a flaw of the film. This is an adaptation of a 2001 novel by Percy Everett, and plenty of adaptations do what American Fiction does with way less success. But I can't help feel that something was maybe lost by moving from the medium of literature to the medium of film. The original text includes Monk's satirical novel in its pages, so you have to literally read it, turning the pages and becoming party to its rapturous consumption yourself. And there is one particularly creative reinterpretation of that process in this film adaptation. There's a somewhat hurried exploration of Hollywood towards the end, but just in terms of this listing exercise, which again is kind of silly, I know, every other entry here, including those below this one, had me walking out of the cinema feeling utterly overwhelmed and captivated by the medium itself. And the ending, which I won't spoil, is very hurried compared to the contemplative build-up. I was also pretty disappointed that we never really got a sense of what Monk as an author wrote about. For example, one of his books is titled after the Satyricon, which is an ancient Roman text that has influenced a great deal of modern fiction from Gatsby to Succession. It's a formally experimental text that explores sex, class, and gender, and even putting that unexplored reference aside, it was a little hard for me to actually see Monk as a genius, despite all the characters constantly calling him one, without knowing or feeling what they mean. The tension between his intellectual life and his family one is crucial to the heart of the film, but it's almost more announced than it is artistically communicated. Most of the plot and story questions are resolved in really quick conversation scenes at the end, but they do, though, include a really beautiful confrontation between Monk and Issa Rae as the author whose commercial success at the start of the film prompted his envy and his frustration. This confrontation is fantastic, and I wish it had had far more narrative emphasis. While I love the scene, it does sort of push this brilliant film into telling, not showing territory, where it sort of remains through the end. It's also perhaps because Jefferson does come from that TV writing background, but with a film, I was hoping for more textural immersion in the settings. The beach, the city, these scene settings felt like backdrops for dialogue more so than real inhabitable places. And that doesn't get in the way of the film, not at all. It's just why this film is down at number 8 for me. And a satire on this creative level, alongside heartfelt personal drama, is way harder to pull off than I think we typically assume, and American Fiction is a damn good result. At number 7, I know sort of controversially low, we have Poor Things, the freakishly bizarre, artistically rambunctious Yorgos Lanthimos' coming-of-age, self-discovery journey, fairy tale, feminist Frankenstein, starring the unbelievably talented Emma Stone as Bella Baxter, alongside Mark Ruffalo, Willem Dafoe, and Rami Youssef. Its strongest parallel on this list is definitely Barbie, two unhuman humans catapulted into the real world, discovering what it means to be a woman and what it means to be alive. And Poor Things is delightful, make no mistake. The set design, the costumes, the visual theatricality, the performances, they're not just quirky, they're stunning. And it's absolutely hilarious, bold, and exciting, and again, Emma Stone's performance is historically captivating and physically compelling. The big shock of the film is in its premise. Defoe, as the paternal Godfrey character, rescued the woman Bella once was from her own suicide attempt through a lobotomy where he implanted her unborn baby's brain into her body. Bella has this infantile charm that sends men into a frenzy, and she goes on a journey through Europe with a sexy but controlling man whom she swiftly outgrows and sort of becomes bored of while he gets more and more enraptured. As a woman without shame, she wanders through landscapes, both physical and conceptual, developing a mature and complex inner life as she's exposed to more people, more ideas, suffering, sex, socialism, capitalism, poverty, pastries, and while this is all obviously oversimplified and hurried, that's part of the film's powerful effect. It is over the top, it is absurd, it has to present essentially contested ideas in extremely simple, almost ludicrous fashion, and I loved it. Because Bella is fundamentally unadjusted to our society, she gets to be this satirical force of communication. Sure, it's funny watching her insult people because she doesn't understand polite customs, but more than that, she isn't quote-unquote well-adjusted enough to ignore extreme injustice the way everyone else does. It might be this Victorian steampunk dreamscape, but it's delivering very clear and poignant reflections on what being civilized really means. Were they groundbreaking concepts? No, and I wish they had committed more to the exploration of moral and political thought, and how various forms of education can not just change your mind, but also develop your inner world. And as I said, I did love the theatricality here, but it was hard not to see some of the film's eccentricities as being just for the sake of it. It's great that we have a distinct directorial flavor here, but I'd love to know what, for example, the fisheye lens actually contributed. And though Emma Stone herself was a producer, and she, in interviews, has said she fully co-signed the way the camera treats her very exposed body in this film, I couldn't shake off a bit of discomfort with how we as the audience consume her navigation of sexuality. Sexuality and her body are crucial to the story here, and the way men view her is often very deeply sinister, but the way the camera itself follows parts of her body sort of makes us party to their experiences rather than hers. And though this is all about Bella's maturing process, she somehow never gets her period, they never discuss contraception, and that takes me to my biggest gripe with this altogether fantastic film, which is its irresolution of its most interesting questions. Bella does eventually return to her home, her version of an ordinary world, and she has this meeting of her maker moment that's of course reminiscent of Frankenstein, and yeah, we saw it in Barbie too, sort of. And I don't want to spoil too much, but the huge sweeping questions here, her identity as a mother, as a daughter, as a hybrid of the two, as a victim, as an agent, they're really quickly resolved in hasty dialogue. And I was deeply curious to see how she would, after everything she's been through and everything she's learned, how she would interact with these sort of seemingly kind men who had controlled her life before her journey. She's now shaken off vile suitors and captors, but these ones, played by Dafoe and Youssef, are far more gentle and nuanced. I mean, she has to wrestle with the very nature or unnature of her creation and her identity and her entire quote-unquote childhood-ish, but instead we meet a new villain whose very simple, over-the-top evilness sort of undermines the heretofore narrative complexity that got us here, and then things just sort of wrap up with a wink and a shrug, and she seems to take on the same surgical vocation that created her, which is huge but isn't really acknowledged. That she's now living with this man who was in love with her during her absolute infant stage of being is never examined, making the entire conceit of her existence seem oriented towards shock or quirkiness rather than story or meaning. So look, in terms of style, though no, I didn't understand every choice, that's absolutely fine. Poor Things is a captivating ride and an aesthetic treat, but this movie is doing more than creating an experience, it's telling a story, and when it comes to that story's substance, Poor Things doesn't do or say anything interesting about all these significant topics it quickly dances through, and there's no part of me that will be thinking back on this story even weeks from now.
Storm, it's powerful. So we need to be quiet for a while.
Killers of the Flower Moon is the latest epic from Martin Scorsese, set in 1920s Oklahoma and taking a long, bleak look at a long, bleak, systematic murder of the Osage Nation in pursuit of their oil wealth. I've noticed that people who really revere this film and are even vying for it to win are often those who already adore Scorsese, which seems obvious, but I do think this film works best in dialogue with, or even just in the context of, his filmographic legacy. The more I think about it in the context of his repertoire, the more I'm blown away, but that's not really my natural cognitive disposition when watching films, nor is it for most viewers, I think. I don't think we really sit there thinking about a director's filmographic legacy while we're watching, and that may be why huge film nerds and critics are more sold on this film than popular audiences. In terms of Scorsese's authorial legacy, Killers of the Flower Moon is at least a little bit defined by what it's not. It ditches the thriller mystery construct of its source text. It's not a rip-roaring gangster film. It doesn't romance the grittiness of crime. It doesn't paint the villains as troubled geniuses. De Niro's character is certainly a personification of the devil in an almost folktale way, smiling and smiling while he orchestrates mass murder, but he's not particularly careful or clever. None of these horrible people are, because they don't have to be. And this film makes us do more than accept that message intellectually. We have to feel it, as the almost monotonous inevitability takes over and squeezes out any semblance of hope or rescue or aid. It's a stirringly painful film with an incredible emotional anchor in Lily Gladstone as Molly Burkhart, who communicates more in the whites of her eyes, the set of her jaw, and the tremble in her voice than I have ever seen on screen, and she fortifies this role with an internal agency that defies the boundaries of its narrative parameters. And of course, the rightful consensus here is that Scorsese wouldn't be the best person to tell this story as it honestly should be told from the Osage perspective. But that said, as the hours go on and Molly is never really afforded a narrative complexity, I almost wonder if she and the Osage in general here were treated with too much distant reverence, so that Molly becomes too much of a symbol. Meanwhile, we're supposed to wrestle with to what extent her murderous husband, Ernest Burkhart, can actually believe he loves her. But the flip side of that equation, her side of the relationship, is never really explored. Leonardo DiCaprio gives a remarkably uncharismatic performance as this very human, wretched buffoon full of intentional ambiguity and moral cowardice. I will say his ultimate character-defining decision, which revolves around his role as a father in the last act, didn't make much sense to me, as having kids doesn't seem to alter his character up until then. And this brings me to the more broad issue I had with Killers of the Flower Moon. Now, I'm never going to complain that a movie is long, but man, this movie felt long too, and that's obviously part of the point, the inevitability that keeps rolling. But I couldn't help thinking that something here felt slightly disjointed. The last act of the film turns into a sort of legal drama that felt like an entirely different movie, and it actually might have been. Scorsese had been writing the script for 2 years when DiCaprio made the brilliant suggestion to turn focus away from the FBI investigation, looking from the outside in, and instead tell the story from the inside out. And I mean, this rehaul is excellent. But I sort of wonder if the final act is a textual remnant of the original script. This is total conjecture. I don't know. And all in all, the camera work, the production design, the character performances, they are all stellar. And the ending coda in particular highlights that we're watching one of the best directors of all time seriously reflect on his legacy as a storyteller and start to use his authorial power for genuine good. And fingers crossed for the Lily Gladstone win.
I have just spent 2 solid weeks with him. He is a pain in the ass, sure, but he's also very smart. Brilliant, I don't know, but very smart. You must know that.
It was hard to find a spot for The Holdovers. In some versions of the list, it's closer to the bottom, because honestly, when I was like a little kid, I sort of thought all movies were gonna be like this, and that I would just prefer some to others for certain reasons. And I'm not trying to devalue the incredible work that went into writing and making this film, because if this were just a ranking of my personal favorites, this would be number one easily. This is so up my alley in terms of personal taste. The literal moment it started, I felt like I was walking through a room I had been in before. The Holdovers follows the unlikely bonds forged over a melancholic Christmas break at a New England prep school in the early 70s in the trio of Paul Giamatti as a curmudgeonly history teacher, Dominic Sessa in the breakout performance of the year as a nerdy, angsty troublemaker student, and Davine Joy Randolph as the school cook grieving her son's death in Vietnam. And this film does just about what it says on the tin. You know more or less where it's going, though you don't know exactly how it'll get there, and it's bathed in this nostalgic charm that absolutely won me over. It's a very literary film, certainly topically in that it centers academia in both its capacity for poetic connectivity and its burdensome isolation as a vocation, but also in how it centers dialogue and symbolic visual storytelling. There's a clear directorial vision here, certainly, but in my view, this is very much a writer's film. It could be a play, it could be a novel, in the way that some others on this list simply couldn't. And the writing is absolutely phenomenal from start to finish, but The Holdovers as a film plays with sound, pacing, time, and space beautifully. The boarding school is its own entire world, and there's a trip to Boston that made me feel like a little kid going into the city for the first time again. The Holdovers is a seamless panoply of intentional moods. I laughed, I cried, I smiled, I nodded. I really felt it in my heart. The themes of loneliness, uncertainty, and grief are all given heartfelt pathways towards companionship, understanding, and hope, which is a beautiful thing to feel as it unfolds. I do think The Holdovers has a subtle, controlling idea articulated by the line, quote, "Before you dismiss something as boring or irrelevant, remember, if you truly want to understand the present or yourself, you must begin in the past." End quote, which applies, of course, to the old scholar seeing himself in the young rebel here in terms of characters. And look, I think the film is just about flawless for what it is and what it's trying to do, but if it were to go to the next level to write a bigger check for itself to cash, I think that core idea would have to seep through the choice to set the film in 1970, 1971. Why then, and why now? Sessa's character bonds with a mother whose son has met the fate that's implicitly facing him down. If he doesn't get his act together, he won't get into college and he'll be drafted to Vietnam. But these are really background stakes to what's ultimately a very timeless character story. And that's great. I can't stress enough how much I loved every minute of this film, but I can't be sure just how much of my heartfelt affection here is due to its shamelessly effective nostalgia pull that maybe could have been taken to another level if its social and cultural setting were treated with a bit more intention and a bit more thematic parallel to today's world. The early 1970s were a huge transition point for American identity. Is there something there that can explain the mid-2020s? I don't know, and I don't think The Holdovers does either, which is absolutely fine, but keeps its ultimate top-tier territory sort of elusive. Regardless, the way these two men come to see themselves in each other is utterly beautiful, and The Holdovers deliver something I always crave in storytelling: narrative symmetry, not just between the two leads, but also from start to finish, with callbacks that aren't just hollow Easter eggs, but are dramatically meaningful and narratively earned. It's my pet favorite of the year, and I will be rewatching it forever.
It's too soon to determine what the results of the bombing are. But I'll bet the Japanese didn't like it.
Oppenheimer has been leading the actual Oscars race since it premiered. At this point, it would be a monumental upset if it doesn't win, and while it's not my number one for the year, I'm not going to be mad at all. Oppenheimer is a pretty rare mix of commercial and artistic success, and while it's full of great performances, Cillian Murphy in particular has this incredible slow transformation from youthful intellectual exuberance to focused leadership to haggard regret, and it's absolutely unbelievable, and the camera knows it. Murphy's face does a great deal of the storytelling work here, as does the film's incredible score. Framed by a few significant moments from his early education and his later retirement, Oppenheimer fuses two distinct timelines, one being Oppenheimer's subjective recount of his life through his 1954 security hearings, and the other being the objective lens of Louis Strauss during his 1959 Senate confirmation hearings. This sort of disjointed framed narrative is our view into the Manhattan Project and the Trinity Test, where the majority of this film's adrenaline lies. And just from a technical filmmaking perspective, this portion of Oppenheimer is genuinely groundbreaking, wonderfully immersive, and bold. After the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and after suffering a personal loss, Oppenheimer's inner life is increasingly fraught with guilt. But of course, in his security hearings, no one's questioning him about his role in bombing civilians, obviously. He's being scrutinized for tenuous ties to the American Communist Party. And he's not really fighting back because, as his wife Kitty says, he thinks he deserves some sort of moral punishment. Nolan also inserts Albert Einstein, not just as this elder source of wisdom, but also to imply a causally connected view of linear history that suggests we're all on a pathway to total doom. Every Nolan film also uses internal image systems where meaning is conveyed not just through obvious symbolism like a poisoned apple, but also, for example, using marbles to represent scientific progress, using sounds of stomping feet, ripples in a pond. Alongside that heavy score, it's almost overly dramatic, but it absolutely works. I do have to note that the writing for Jean Tatlock, Oppenheimer's communist psychiatrist lover, is pretty poor, and though Emily Blunt gets a few powerful moments as Kitty, she's likewise overly sidelined and troped into simplicity. And my complaint there isn't just about the representation of women societally, it's a genuine weak point in the storytelling. But even putting that aside, the reason Oppenheimer isn't at the top for me is that I think the meaning of the story is at times buried by the impressiveness of the film. I think the strongest scene of the film, and there are a few, is the last, where the crescendo of significance is delivered through just a few words and a menacing montage. But as a whole, I think Nolan has this tendency to make things unnecessarily complicated. I had read American Prometheus, the source text for the film, before seeing it, but I'm pretty sure that if I hadn't, I'd be pretty lost on the various hearings and the huge range of supporting characters that come and go. And Nolan has said that his films are meant to be experienced rather than understood, per se. And while I appreciate that artistic concept, I think both the formal construct of the film and the extreme reverence with which Oppenheimer as a subject is treated does build a distance between the film and its audience that hampers this film's ability to have meaning in our regular day-to-day lives. To me, the film does communicate that in our democratic society, we tend to include moral decision-making in our broader division of labor, and in doing so, we leave the most important decisions to the worst kind of people. But this is almost buried under Nolan's ability to imbue, a denied handshake or a clipboard or a perceived shoemaking insult with this feeling of grave significance. And to be clear, I don't want everything to be super obvious. I like that he works through subtext, but I do think the relevance of this film should be more inescapable for the audience as we're watching it. We might be rattled, we might be in awe, we probably are, but are we going to be changed? That's admittedly asking a lot, but all in all, I do think Oppenheimer was more interested in impressing us than it was in resonating on a personal level. And that's fine, this is still an incredible feat, but for me, that's why it can't be number one.
Das hier ist die Mauer vom Lager. Ja, das ist die Lagermauer. Also da haben wir auch noch Wein gepflanzt, damit das zuwächst, damit man das nicht mehr so sieht.
Directed by Jonathan Glazer, The Zone of Interest was easily the film that gave me the most pause in making this video. It's the hardest to think about, yes, but it also just doesn't feel right to compare it to or rank it amongst the other nominees, and that's due to more than subject matter. So The Zone of Interest takes the form sort of a slice-of-life film, focusing on the 1943 home and professional life of Rudolf Höss, the commander of the Auschwitz concentration camp. With Christian Friedel opposite Sandra Hüller as Rudolph's wife Hedwig, the couple and their 5 children have built their mini bourgeois dream life, including a brand new house that literally shares a garden wall with the concentration camp. With sound design by Johnny Byrne and scored by Mika Levy, The Zone of Interest is, as Glazer noted, really 2 films. There's one you see, and there's one you hear. The one we see is extremely matter-of-fact. The set was built based on years of exacting research, and besides a couple of dolly shots, all the household footage is captured by cameras that were hidden from the cast so they wouldn't play to them, they wouldn't angle to them. No false lighting was used. Glazer is profoundly cognizant of the way a camera inherently fetishizes its subject. So here, it's not just that the plot isn't dramatic, it's also that we don't visually consume any suffering directly. And it's not just the structural catharsis of typical storytelling that's discarded, it's also the technical traditions of filmmaking. But the second film, the one we hear, is nothing short of horrifying. Gunshots, screams, yells, the churning machinery of trains and furnaces, the machinery of genocide, forces us to constantly imagine because we absolutely know exactly what is happening on the other side of the wall. It's not that the Hosses live in a state of willful ignorance. The murders on which their lives are built seep into their daily reality in myriad ways. The film is punctuated with these insidious details, like the way the kids play or how Hedwig gossips with friends, a sort of unspeakable poison in a home life that otherwise could reasonably be called somewhat relatable. There is kind of a plot here in the sense that a sequence of events does occur, but the plot really is not the point. This film isn't designed to stir emotion, but to impose a feeling. The difference being, per Robert McKee, that emotions are short-term experiences we burn through and can discard quickly, whereas feeling is long-term, deeply pervasive, changing days, weeks, maybe years of our lives. When people hear World War II movie, Holocaust movie, we maybe typically brace ourselves for romanticized emotion and catharsis, but Glazer intentionally avoids any semblance of drama, any poetics of narrative payoff, any formal or substantive romanticization. Glazer is looking to turn our stomachs, and I won't undermine the impact of the film's very audacious ending by explaining it here, but it connects the past with the present in a way that implicates you while you're sitting there. And while the zone of interest is specifically about one bourgeois family, Glazer and his team have been very explicit that its fundamental idea, this exploration of the banality of evil on the suffering on which we build our lives, isn't saying, look what they did, it's saying, look what we do. There is one beacon of hope as well represented in the film, and I can't say I really understood it while I was watching, but this film got so under my skin that I was reading about its making for days afterwards. I still can't stop thinking about it. And man, every single choice, from the idea of dry heaving as opposed to actually vomiting, to the directorial instruction that Hedwig never slowed down enough to have a moment of genuine reflection, she's always moving around the house, is incredibly well thought through and intentional. Yes, it's a film, but it's really an experience, and I think what it's doing communicatively is more ironically akin to what museums and monuments try to do. The reason I don't have Zone of Interest at number 1, where it very well could be, is just that though the film as an end result does speak for itself, it is incredible, it's really the methodology and thought process behind its making that makes it so extraordinary to me. That, and more so than even a Nolan or a Villeneuve film, it just has to be seen in cinemas. And if anyone has watched it at home, please do comment with how that worked out for you. I can't imagine that. And my worry is that unless they do re-releases later, this isn't a movie I'll be revisiting years from now. It is, without a doubt, the film on this list that I value the most. It's the most thought-provoking and moving, and it's enormously difficult to make a film that reignites our visceral consciences, and that's what we have here.
If two strangers even walk by each other in the street, and their clothes accidentally brush, because it means there must have been something between them in their past lives.
It is absolutely incredible to me that Past Lives is the directorial debut of Celine Song, who delivers this topically simple story with delicate complexity, balancing universal themes with deep specificity and demonstrating a comprehensive understanding of film as a medium for story. The film revolves around 3 characters, but also an idea, the Korean concept of inyon, this belief that interactions between people in life are due to who they were to each other in past lives. Past Lives centers Nora, who emigrated away from Korea at age 12, leaving behind her childhood crush Hae-sung, and started a writing life in New York. Years later, the two reconnect online, which eventually becomes untenable. Nora then meets Arthur in New York, another artist, and by the time Hae-sung visits her in New York, she's both married and living an entirely new life. And I mean no shade at Margot Robbie when I say that the real Best Actress snub nomination this year to me was certainly Greta Lee, who as Nora is confident, funny, personable, curious, sorrowful, uncertain. She's such a brilliantly realized character that you forget she's a character. She's someone I can imagine sitting across the bar, which is exactly how the film opens. And this is all thanks not only to Lee's acting, but also Song's understanding of spatial reality, the costume choices, and the way the internet is involved. These childhood friends find each other through the internet and they forge a beautiful adult friendship across the world on Skype. I feel like filmmakers shy away from involving technology socially in this way, so we only kind of get it in crappy Netflix teen originals, but Song knows how to make it beautiful, how to move through time and through space, through editing, and through building up a sense of Nora's life in Brooklyn and Hae-sung's life in Korea. By the time they meet in person again, I can feel myself how Nora as a person is inextricably defined by where she lives. They feel so removed from one another. Cultural identity is a huge theme in this film, and though the idea that your life is shaped and defined by your decisions is universal and increasingly relatable as you get older, though all lives are to varying degrees haunted by the lives they might have been, Past Lives is also sharing a story particular to the experience of moving, not just to another country, but to another culture. Nora and Hae-sung are both wonderful characters, but to me, the subtle heart of the film is Arthur, Nora's New York husband. In lesser films, he would have been the bad guy in some way, shape, or form, but Past Lives is far too mature and balanced for that kind of foil, making it all the more heart-wrenching. And the strength of this character is testament not only to the writing and the performance, but also the directing. This here shot alone builds a very real feeling intimacy. We can't really root against this guy when we've seen him at his most human, when we felt like we're in the room here. These two men carry very different kinds of masculinity, and Past Lives doesn't take a stance on which is better. The balance is the point. Just as Nora has to live with not knowing if she made the right decisions in life, there are no right decisions, there are just decisions, and from there, things have to be right. I love how Past Lives is grounded in this specific story about being a Korean-American expat, specifically about these cultural differences, but again, its core is universal. And it's not just about major life decisions like moving across the world. I mean, she was 12, it really wasn't her call. Past Lives dramatizes the vast enormity of all the lives we don't live by virtue of living the one that we do. We don't all learn new cultures and languages and take new names, but anyone who lives a life could have lived 1,000 others. It's a beautiful torment that comes with the sheer act of waking up day by day, and artists from Nico to Robert Frost have been exploring it for years. I don't want to say too much else about what happens here, because honestly not much happens, which only works because it is incredibly well made. Song creates all sorts of feelings, all the way from deep love to almost funny awkwardness. There's a great deal of silence in this film, which is an authorial mark of confidence in the actors and in the audience. She knows we can feel the subtext without having to explain it to us. I also love how deeply empathetic this film is, both through and to its own characters. It's not a film about kindness per se, but as great fiction can remind you of the worlds that people carry with them, it has the intrinsic capacity to awaken latent empathy for people you know and people you don't. As a film, Past Lives is the perfect balance of poetic and prosaic. The final scene in particular is so beautiful and quiet and open that I processed it kind of like a thriller, holding my breath, totally enraptured. Song comes from theater, so it's no surprise that the dialogue, in its content, expressing extraordinary life complexities in simple terms, but also in its form, the use of language and code switching is all phenomenal, and that's really emblematic of what this film is as a whole. Past Lives is about the worlds we carry in ourselves, all the things that we are not, and how we can live with that. And as an artistic articulation of that concept, it's next to flawless. So don't underestimate the simple scope of past lives, because that is precisely its strength.
Samuel had no enemies.
Stop. I did not kill him.
That's not the point.
Anatomy of a Fall, co-written and directed by Justine Triet, is a film that I don't want to oversell, not because I don't think it can live up to hype, but because the less you know going into it, the better. All I knew was a French courtroom drama and Swan Arlo with long hair, and that was enough. But when we think about legal thrillers or courtroom dramas, we conjure up quite familiar expectations, whether from our associations in reality or because it's a popular film genre. And it would be a mistake, I think, to say that Triet isn't interested in that norm. She very much is. This film actually relies on the concept of our preconceived expectations of both the pursuit of justice and the composition of fiction. It's a simple mystery premise. A famous novelist, Sandra, played by the absolutely masterful Sandra Hüller, again, is accused of murdering her husband Samuel, who was found dead by their partially blind preteen son Daniel, having fallen, jumped, or been pushed, it's unclear, from their attic window way up high in the French Alps. Sandra's defense attorney, Vincent, is someone from her past, a very restrained love interest, friend maybe, and even his perception of her culpability is withheld from us as we watch the two respond to a multifaceted rhetorical assault from the prosecution. Her marriage, her sexual identity, her own novels, her own words are used against her, while Vincent works to make a case that Samuel committed suicide. And in this terrible liminal zone between one reality where his mother is a murderer and the other where his father took his own life is, of course, Daniel and his dog Snoop, who slowly steps into the central role that he really always had. This is a slow, restrained film that only occasionally sizzles with these blazes of incredibly incisive writing, and I can certainly admit that there are a few segments that feel a little long, a little slow. It's intentionally an inefficient film, and I think that works because as the audience, we have a job to do. We're situated as the jury of Sandra's guilt, and as new pieces of information are revealed, either consciously or subconsciously, our brains are constantly searching to draw causal inferences and fit this life, this marriage, into a pre-built narrative schemata. But then we'll learn something else, or we'll see another angle, we'll get new context, so we can never quite nestle into the comfort that we instinctively crave. And this form of judgment is something we do, obviously, anytime we're on a jury, but that's always, really. We're always judging based on tiny snippets of people's lives, and particularly when we're watching fiction, we're trained to make sweeping assumptions, and we bring with us all sorts of social prejudice that Triet plays with masterfully. The use of rhetoric in this film is masterful. We see strategies like characterization, syllogism, analogy. We see the blending of forensic oratory concerned with the past alongside deliberative persuasion concerned with the future. It's all blended together, and the lines between reality and fiction are blurred both by the characters and through the story itself. And all along, Sandra Hüller performs an incredible balancing act of a woman that we mostly want to believe but just can't quite get comfortable with. She does lie, and as a writer who cannibalizes her own life, she's good at it. She even says fiction destroys reality. And because Sandra is unrelentingly unapologetic for who she is, she never quite carries herself like a victim, which, as it makes her seem guilty, forces us to reckon with why we're making that connective assumption, why we make the judgments we do. Anatomy of a Fall is a brilliant exploration of how the intricate complexities of true life can't always fit into the cognitive molds we want them to. It's carried by an intellectually impassioned script, but the film editing and visual portrayal is remarkable as well. It's an icy burn of the film, masterfully messing with the rules of story, genre, form, character, and payoff, and using remarkable restraint to leave us wanting more. It's my film of the year due to its balancing act of keeping us on our toes and speaking to the backs of our minds. It's an introspective puzzle box that's almost more to do with us, the audience, than the character characters, all while painting a brilliantly complex portrait of a marriage. You can watch it a dozen different ways and notice 100 new details each time. While it can be slow and grating to watch, the more you put into it, the more you get out. I was fully hooked the entire time, fully sold on each and every one of these characters, and absolutely blown away with the creative intelligence that went into this movie's making. So there we have it, my arguably undisciplined blend of objective and subjective analysis of 2023's finest films, and also Maestro and Barbie. No, I'm kidding. Look, what a year for cinema. If you have your own ranking, or a top 3, or a top 5, or a top 1, someone you're rooting for, or if you have a personal favorite that's maybe different from your number 1 overall, please do share it in the comments. I am more interested in what you guys think than what the Academy does. But as mentioned in the intro, I also thought that there were some intriguing, consistent themes amongst these 10. None ubiquitous, obviously, but to start, the 2 that engage most seriously with American history center protagonists who consider themselves morally neutral. Oppenheimer intellectualizes his way into believing that he can just do his job and things will be right, while Ernest Burkhart in Killers of the Flower Moon is seemingly too straight up dumb to even consider himself. And more broadly, this Frankenstein-esque idea of inventing and creating and unleashing without pausing to sufficiently consider moral consequences is deeply explored, of course, in Oppenheimer, but also evoked in Barbie and Poor Things, 2 stories where women face their own makers and, to some degree, the consequences of their own making. Multiple films this year deny us standard narrative catharsis. American Fiction, Past Lives, Anatomy of a Fall, Killers of the Flower Moon all play on our standard expectations and subvert them to varying degrees, and zone of interest, of course. But my favorite connective theme this year was the way in which multiple films implicated the audience in the very delivery of their principal ideas. The self-aware coda at the end of Killers of the Flower Moon reflects not just authorial culpability, but also our consumption of sensational fiction as the audience. Anatomy of a Fall, of course, is built on our preconceived cognitive schemata and judgments. American Fiction holds a mirror up to particularly, though not exclusively, white consumer culture. Past Lives opens with a mini audience-oriented bar conversation making us part of the judgment process. Oppenheimer flips the script on how we sort of naturally root for our hero, and of course, more than any other, The Zone of Interest necessitates a painful complicity in how horrors are compartmentalized and put in glass boxes or over fences, both in history and right now. Stepping back, looking at all these films all together this year, I realized that because I normally focus so much on TV analysis, and because the industries are bleeding into each other so much, I myself too easily treat TV and film interchangeably. But through watching these 10 films in particular, I had a fantastic time re-educating myself on the intrinsic value of film as an art medium, as an experience, as an end in and of itself. So I obviously have a ton more to say about each of these films. It was definitely a challenge to keep this video from being like a year long, but I had a lot of fun making it, so thank you so very much for watching. As ever, I deeply appreciate it. Thanks, guys.